The Galactic Conclave had a saying, asterisk, some species are born beneath notice. Asterisk, the Velshera were one of them. They had no warships worth mentioning, no resource deposits that the great powers coveted, no political weight to throw around the long obsidian tables of the conclave chambers. For 300 years, the Velshera had attended every session, filed every petition, raised every procedural objection, and been ignored with the practiced elegance that only ancient bureaucracies could achieve. Nobody remembered when they had first arrived. Nobody cared to. Riven first heard about the Velshera on a Tuesday, which was, he'd later think, exactly the kind of unremarkable day on which remarkable things tended to begin. He was a junior diplomatic attaché for the Terran Compact, 29 years old, underpaid, running on bad coffee and stubbornness, reviewing background briefs on minor conclave member species before the upcoming session of Accord. Most of his colleagues skimmed these files. Riven read them. Every word. The Velshera file was 17 pages long. Mostly, it was a bureaucratic obituary dressed up in neutral language. Limited galactic footprint, diminishing population, unresolved territorial dispute. But buried on page 12, there was a paragraph that made Riven set down his coffee and sit very still. Asterisk, the Velshera homeworld of Shavel-Kor has been subject to systematic atmospheric harvesting by the Drethian Collective since 2AGC. The Velshera have filed 214 formal complaints. All have been dismissed on procedural grounds. Current Velshera population, estimated 340,000. Pre-harvesting population, 4.2 million, asterisk. He read that paragraph 3 times. Then he pulled up every file the Compact had on the Drethian Collective, on the Conclave's procedural code, on atmospheric harvesting doctrine, and on every dismissed petition the Velshera had ever submitted. He read through the night. Alara was the last appointed speaker of the Velshera. The title had once meant something. A voice given wings, a bridge between her people and the galaxy's great powers. Now it meant she was the one who sat in the back rows of the conclave chamber and watched resolutions pass that erased her species line by line. She was old, by human reckoning. Her bioluminescent markings had faded from vivid gold to pale silver. She moved carefully, as one does when carrying a grief too heavy to rush with. She had stopped expecting anything years ago. That was the cruelest thing about prolonged abandonment. It didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, quietly, and rearranged the furniture of your hope until there was none left. She was reviewing the agenda for the session of Accord when a message arrived from a name she didn't recognize. Asterisk Speaker Alara, my name is Riven, Terran Compact Diplomatic Attaché. I've read your petitions. All 214 of them. I want to talk. Asterisk. She stared at the message for a long moment. Then, because hope is a stubborn and stupid thing that refuses to fully die even when you've stopped feeding it, she wrote back. They met in one of the Conclave's smaller conference rooms, the kind used for meetings that weren't important enough to warrant the grand chambers. Riven arrived first. He was younger than Alara had expected, with the kind of restless energy that either accomplishes great things or burns itself out spectacularly. He had brought documents, organized into sections, color-tabbed, annotated in margins. Alara looked at the stack and felt something crack open in her chest. You actually read them, she said. Every word. He slid the stack across the table. The Drethian Collective has been gaming Conclave procedural code for decades. Every time one of your petitions gets close to a committee vote, they invoke Clause 7 Delta, asterisk, unresolved territorial sovereignty precludes environmental review. Asterisk, but here's the thing. He tapped a highlighted section. Clause 7 Delta was written in the context of contested border disputes. Shavel-Kor is not a contested border. The Velshera have sovereign title, recognized by original conclave charter. The Drethians aren't invoking 7 Delta correctly. They're invoking it strategically because no one has ever called them on it. Alara looked at the highlighted section. Her translator implant rendered his words precisely, but she found herself reading the document herself, slowly, her pale markings flickering with something she had not felt in years. We raised this in Session 12, she said carefully. The Procedural Committee ruled. The Procedural Committee was chaired by a Drethian affiliate. Riven leaned forward. And Session 12 was 20 years ago. The current committee chair is Councillor Meth of the Urani Accord. and the Urani have a border grievance with the Drethian collective that's been festering for 40 years. They would love to set a precedent that clips Drethian procedural maneuvering. Alara was quiet for a moment. Outside the small window, the conclave's orbital station drifted against a field of stars. Why? She finally asked. Why does this matter to you? To humanity? Riven thought about the paragraph on page 12. About 4 million becoming 340,000. About 214 unanswered voices. Because someone has to, he said. And we're new enough to this that we haven't learned yet which fights aren't worth having. What followed was not a dramatic single confrontation. It was 3 months of work. Riven drafted a formal challenge to the Drethian collective's procedural history, citing 47 precedent cases and a clause in the original conclave charter that the Drethians had apparently assumed everyone had forgotten. He hadn't forgotten. He had found it at 3 a.m. on his 4th night of research, and he'd made a noise that his colleagues in the next office had heard through the wall. He was not alone. This was important. Humanity's diplomatic corps was small, newly established, and carrying none of the accumulated grudges that made the older species so cautious. Ambassador Dren Torres took Riven's brief to the Terran Compact's senior council and came back with a mandate: pursue it. Alara, for her part, did something she hadn't done in decades. She reached out to the other forgotten ones, minor species who had long since stopped raising their hands in conclave sessions because raising hands had taught them only that hands could be ignored. She asked them to watch, to bear witness, to be present. 31 minor species sent observers to the session of Accord. The Drethian collective's senior delegate, Preetor Gall, was not accustomed to being surprised. He was a large being with a long memory and a longer list of favors owed to him by powers across the conclave. When the Terran Compact formally submitted the challenge, he expected it to die in committee within a week. Instead, Councillor Meth of the Urani Accord seconded the challenge before Gall's legal team had finished reading it. The session that followed was 7 hours long. Riven sat at the Terran delegation table, his annotated documents spread before him, and answered every procedural counter the Drethians raised. Not with passion, with precision. With the 47 precedent cases. With the original charter clause. With the quiet, devastating evidence that the Velshera had been following the rules perfectly for 300 years, and that the rules had been used against them like a weapon. Alara sat in the observer section. She did not speak. She had spoken 214 times and been unheard. She watched instead. Watched a young human with bad posture and ink-stained fingers dismantle 3 decades of procedural theater, one citation at a time. When the committee voted, it wasn't close. Clause 7 Delta, as applied to the Velshera petitions, was ruled procedurally invalid. The atmospheric harvesting operations on Shavelkor were placed under emergency conclave review, with immediate partial suspension pending full adjudication. The Drethians would appeal. Everyone knew it. This was not the end, but it was no longer nothing. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Alara found Riven surrounded by colleagues, being congratulated with the particular loud warmth that humans seemed to apply to everything. She waited until the crowd thinned, then approached. He turned and saw her, and something in his expression went quiet and serious in the way that very young people's faces do when they suddenly understand the weight of what they've been standing next to. "It won't be resolved quickly," he said, before she could speak. "The appeal process alone could take years." "I know," Alara said. Her bioluminescent markings, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, were flickering warm gold. "I have waited 300 years, Attaché Riven. I am familiar with patience." She paused. "But today, for the first time in 300 years, we did not wait alone." Riven looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a small, human gesture that carried more weight than a speech. Somewhere behind them, in the conclave chamber, 31 observer delegations were filing out in silence. Several of them, Alara had noticed, were already talking to each other. Some of them, she suspected, had also brought unread petitions. And now, perhaps, there was someone who would read them. The galaxy, it turned out, had not forgotten the Velshera. It had simply been waiting for someone stubborn enough to remind it.